Hey guys, just got 5 games, all of which have been submitted by chess.com friends, and so this is just for fun. We're going to work our way up in terms of ratings, and the first game was submitted, I think, Mad MR2 Matt, rated 800, against Finaro 10, rated just under 800, and we're going to see all these games from the white perspective. So Matt's playing with black. And we have d4, d5, and the accelerated London system. So what I realised is that actually the normal London system is bring your knight out to f3 first. Okay. So knight comes out, knight to f3, and we're preparing a kind of fianchetto by the look of things on the king side. e3 is played, bishop fianchettos, bishop d3, very normal London kind of thing, and now c4 from Finaro. Which I kind of like this move because it's preparing to maybe bring the knight out here, which is more aggressive than bringing the knight to d2. If the pawn takes, we've got bishop takes, and then white does have this central pawn majority. Okay, so Matt responds with e6, allowing c takes d, and now knight takes d5. So this knight is now attacking the bishop. And white does have a 2-on-1 pawn majority in the middle now. We have knight to c3, and now knight takes bishop. So this messes up white's pawn structure a bit. So white now has doubled pawns on the f-file, has an isolated pawn on the d-file, which is also attacked twice by queen and knight, and bishop, actually 3 times. So it's going to be very hard to defend that. Knight captures, queen captures. And now, this is interesting. So an attack on the king with a discovery on the queen, on black's queen. So it looks like this was in fact possibly a trap by white. Okay, so check with a discovered attack on the queen, and the queen is going to fall, but is defended by the bishop. Okay, now white has a bishop under attack as well as a knight. Retrieves the bishop because the knight's defended. Castles, castles. Right, so black is actually up 1 pawn at this moment in time, but does have the bishop pair. And slightly better organised pawns because of this extra pawn on the f-file. Okay, so pawn attacks, bishop retreats, and we trade bishop for knight. Black is still up 1 pawn. Yeah, so we have 7 against 6. Now f5 and h4, striking down the king's flank. So we have an exchange of pawns. Rook comes across to attack the pawn. Bishop moves to f3 to attack the rook. Rook moves. And now g4. This is quite aggressive in the middle. Black ignores the threat and puts a double attack against the a-pawn. White defends with the bishop, and now the pawn falls. So black is now up 2 pawns. Now up 1 pawn because of the awkward f-pawn. We have a check. King pushes forward to hit the rook. Pawn defends. We have 2 attackers actually on this pawn now. But instead we have bishop to b3 with check. King advances. Rook comes across. Rook comes across. Pawn advances. This is now an aggressive pawn. Okay. Black pushes forward with check, but this is a fork on the king and on the bishop. Okay, so the pattern here was, why did my opponent make this move? Well, in fact, the rook's defended there by this pawn anyway, so but even so, you have to always be aware when you've got 2 pieces on the same line, whether it's a rank or a file, be aware for forks. So the bishop now falls. Now black is up 6 points in material. King to f1. Rook comes down now. Pawn pushes. Rook comes here. Pawn pushes again. Check. Now this actually takes the bishop away from the defense of a8, the promotion square. So it's a check. Was it a check with purpose? Rook comes to here, and that is checkmate by black. Just in time, preventing that, but nice little finish. All right, let's move on to game number 2. This is also in the 800s, and this is a game by Thin White Duke 85. We've seen him before. We have e4, e5. The wayward queen attack. Gotta love a bit of this. Okay, good response by black. This is correct. Knight to c6 defends the pawn. That is the real target of this attack. You can't play that, you can't play that because the pawn falls. So, bishop out to c4, threatening checkmate. Queen to e7 protects against mate. Knight to c3. Knight now comes out to attack the queen, and the queen retreats all the way to e2. We have g6 now, maybe again preparing the bishop to fianchetto here. Knight to f3, preparing to castle. Bishop fianchettos, white castles, black castles. Now d3, adding another defender to this pawn. It's now defended 3 times. Very standard setup here on white's part. Black does the same with d6. Now the knight comes in to the hole, attacking the queen, also attacking the pawn, also attacking c7. So we have an exchange of knights in the middle. Bishop comes out to attack the knight, and we have a pawn kick, pawn to h3. Now here comes in the knight with 2 attackers on this guy here, and also attacking the queen. So the queen has to move. Bishop takes, pawn takes, because the queen cannot capture. Now white's king is somewhat exposed, and now a fork on queen and rook. So now we have queen coming into g5, proposing a trade. We have a trade of queens, and we lose the rook. So now we're in an interesting situation where we've got black's got 2 rooks and 1 bishop, but this bishop is not, we have to say, very good. It's blocked by this pawn, and this pawn is blocked by this pawn. So currently cannot make progress up the board. Bishop really has no good squares to go to. So h6 is pushed, kicking the bishop back. Bishop retreats. King now moves into the corner. Grab a pawn. Bishop now retreats. Now, because this was actually a skewer with the bishop here, there's an undefended pawn behind it. Rook grabs the pawn. So now black is actually up 3 points in material. White grabs a pawn. f5 now. This is interesting. If the pawn gets to take, can't really recapture with this pawn because then there's 2 rooks looking at f2 there. So what does white do here? Advances a4. Pawn takes, and we have d takes. But now this pawn is undefended. Rook takes the pawn. King advances. Okay, now things get fun. So we have 2 rooks attacking this pawn here. But here black, oh no, black cannot capture because he spotted that the bishop is still defending that pawn. So this rook has to retreat. Retreats a5, c5, a6. Rook now comes down because this pawn is now blocking the bishop's defense of f2. So it looks like this king is in a lot of trouble. King moves up, bishop moves up. Bishop now sacrifices itself for a pawn. Pawn to a7. So here we'd like to play this, but again this bishop is very well placed, protecting that square. So who's going to win this? Rook checks. Check again to here. Check again with the bishop. This is now looking treacherous for white. King moves again. Rook moves up with check. King moves again. Bishop comes down defending the pawn. And now white gets his queen. Check. King runs away. And that, my friends, is a lovely checkmate. So well done to Thin White Duke. Let's move on to game number 3. All good fun. Stricky 77. Another repeat offender. e4, e5, and what are we going to have? The Vienna. And bishop to c5. Now when you get bishop to c5, this announces the wayward queen line. So we've just seen a wayward queen game with the queen coming out on move 2. This is the Vienna version. After knight comes out, then bishop comes out. Queen to there, familiar, and the queen has to come out to defend. Now we have f3, which has its merits. You know, the pawn's defending this pawn. It's preventing the queen from coming in and capturing on f2, which would force the king to d1. I think normally I might play this move. It adds a second attacker to there, so you can have queen takes e5. But we have f3, pawn kicks the queen, queen retreats, h5 now. So this king side is looking a little bit more open, but the queen is also running out of squares. I think an alternative move here as well would have been, no, it wouldn't have been that, because then queen takes the bishop, winning a piece. Okay, so we have h5, queen retreats, knight comes out, knight comes in, attacking the queen. Very, very thematic move. Attacking the queen and attacking the c7 pawn with the potential fork as well. So the queen moves across, defending against the fork. Queen g3. That's a curious move. This pawn is undefended. I guess that's the target. King castles, queen grabs e5. Yep. And now we're in a very interesting situation. Look at the relative position of the king and the queen, right? They're both on these light squares, and white has a knight ready to jump into e7 with a royal fork, forking queen and king. However, that square is currently protected by this dark squared bishop. So what can you do about the dark squared bishop? I think one interesting move might even be d4. However, that if bishop takes the pawn, then the bishop's now attacking our queen. So bishop comes back to d6, attacking white's queen, and the knight comes in anyway. So the knight comes in with check, 100% forcing move. Black must get out of check on the next turn. There's only two ways to do it. Either bishop takes knight, or the king has to move here. So bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop. And now, because black has castled on this side, it's looking a little bit precarious on there. We have to say, white also has the bishop pair. White does have an undefended piece, pawn on c2, which black grabs, and d4. So again, even if you're right in the middle game, right? Central control is never a bad thing. Queen retreats. Bishop grabs the knight. Wow. So that was the point of that move as well. I didn't even notice that. Bishop grabs the knight. So this is a discovered attack by moving the pawn. But where has the knight got? The knight actually has no squares here. Can't go there. Can't go there because of the pawns. And the king is blocking this square. So the knight is actually pretty stuck. I think the only real defense would have been to move the king to defend the knight. Black misses it. Drops the knight. Now we have two attackers on this rook. Queen moves across. We trade queens, doubling pawns in the center for black. And now bishop takes rook. And Stricky is now +5 after this exchange. However, still hasn't castled. So we develop. Knight comes out with development, attacking the pawn on d4. d5 is pushed. And now we castle long. Interesting move. So it puts the rook straight on d1, attacking the knight on d4. We attack the bishop. Now, in this situation, yeah, you do the trade. Because you're up in material, you're up a whole rook at this point. Trades. Okay, rook comes up, attacking the pawn. Knight finally develops, but this looks like a blunder, doesn't it? Because the knight has just moved onto a square where it can be captured. Bishop takes knight. Rook attacks bishop, bishop retreats. Rook d1. That's an interesting one. I think maybe lifting the rook to e3 onto a dark square, maybe across to here, would have been better. Okay, king attacks rook. Rook slides across, attacking the bishop. Rook retreats to a dark square. Check, king b1. Bishop comes in, b3 attacks the bishop. Now we've got lots and lots of pawns on light squares. The weakness, of course, is the rearmost pawn of this pawn chain. If the bishop can come in, it could be gobble, gobble, gobble time. Bishop comes in attacking the rook. So here again, I might have thought about d2. You know, when you've still got pawns on the 2nd rank or 7th rank, then getting your own rook onto the 7th rank is not a bad thing. Black would also love to get a rook onto the 7th rank and attack these pawns that still haven't moved. But we have rook c1. Check. King moves to b2. Now we're getting all 3 of our pieces are on dark squares. We have an attack on the rook. Here I'd be very tempted to trade rooks, but we have rook a4. Rook comes across. Now rook c3, hitting the bishop, but still these pawns are undefended. Plus our rook has now abandoned the back rank, so it's possible now for the bishop to come in. Bishop comes in. So now what you need to be thinking about is advancing these pawns onto dark squares where the bishop cannot touch them. We have a pawn push. Looks like a sacrifice of the pawn. Bishop takes pawn. At least now the rook is defending the 2nd pawn in the chain. Pawn pushes again. Not quite sure why black didn't capture this pawn on the first move as an in-between move and then capture this pawn, because both were there. This is forcing, but then I get, oh no, it can't, because rook takes rook, undefended. Yeah, I couldn't have done that. All right, so b5. Rook advances. Rook behind the pawn. Bishop now comes in. This bishop would love to be on this square, hitting both rooks, but can't get there yet. Rook takes a5. Bishop comes in attacking the rook. Rook b4. Simple, simple move. Pawn's now double defended while it's attacked twice. Bishop comes back. King attacks bishop. Bishop comes back again. And white decides to push here. There's no defense of this pawn since the king is blocking these rooks from the defense on the 3rd rank. Bishop grabs pawn. Pawn advances. Very typical pattern here. Now the threat is rook to a8. And if rook captures, we have a queen, right? If we go here, rook can't capture the pawn because it's pinned. So king advances. Now rook a7. So we have 2 attackers on this pawn and we have 2 defenders. Ooh, that pawn is defended, I do believe. Yes, yes. Loses his bishop. So now white is a full rook up. Pair up the rooks again. Pawn falls to the rook. Now do we exchange rooks? Yes, we do. Okay, now the king comes in. King moves. Slightly precarious because black has a 3-on-1 majority on the king side here. King moves, and now the a4, the a pawn moves, a2 to a4. So what's interesting here is that this rook is guarding the b file. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 steps to promotion, but it's black's turn. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4 steps to promotion. So in a straight foot race, black's pawn will win. Pawn advances, pawn advances, pawn advances, pawn advances, pawn advances, check. Okay, lots of options here. The rook could retreat to b1, ready to capture on f1. That's a possibility. But if he does that, if he captures there, king can move here, potentially win the pawn. We have a check. And now the king moves back. Now the rook drops back, but to b2, not to b1. Allowing the queen. Wow, okay. Which way do you think this one's going to go? King moves back to c3. Okay, because it comes with check. King was in check, and also the pawn behind it is now vulnerable. Queen grabs. King to here. Check. Queen grabs. Wow. And surely this has to be now a victory for black. Okay. It's got to come, right? Grabs a pawn, and that is a fork on king and rook. So it's going to be all over very soon. Yep, indeed. And checkmate there. Okay. So, interesting game. Very interesting game. Right. Next one. We are now again in the 1000 to 1100 range, and this is from WASP79. The Reti. Slav Invitation, and e4. Okay, all normal development so far. We have a pin by the bishop. We kick the bishop. Bishop retreats, double kick. Bishop retreats again. Now we have two attackers on this pawn. It's only got the one defender. We ignore the threat and push h4. This is an absolute barnstorm with this game, by the way. Okay, now h5 gives the bishop only two options. It can retreat to here or even grab the pawn. What does the bishop do? We grab the pawn. Knight takes, bishop attacks knight. Knight retreats, okay? Who would you rather be in this situation? Let's find out. g5. This is super aggressive play. Okay, the pawn can be captured, but it's protected by the knight. Pawn takes, knight takes. Knight comes out to d7. Bishop now develops. Neither side is castled at this point, okay? Now, g6 is pushed, and this pawn is pinned, because if this pawn captures, rook h1 wins the queen. King will have to move. Or in fact, no. Bishop f1 is playable. But even so, you don't want to lose your rook. You don't want to lose your rook! Surely you don't want to lose your rook. King moves. Oh no, my queen. And can you see the next move? This is a thing of beauty. Pawn takes f7, checkmate. Wow. Wow. What a game. What a game. The fact that this knight is here, protecting this pawn, and Harry the h-pawn checkmates the king. And this looks winning for black, right? But no, this is a blunder. Capturing the queen is a blunder. Falls to a beautiful, beautiful checkmate. You do not see many of those. All right, fifth and final game now. This is Bailey Bankai, rated in the 1400s, against I Hate My Queen. All right. e4, e5, the Vienna game. Okay, love seeing these Viennas and the Vienna Gambit. This is the correct response by I Hate My Queen. Now pawn takes is normal, and typically here I think we trade knights, but we have queen to f3. Knight takes. Queen could recapture, but b recaptures. This is very commonly played again in the Vienna. You've got a nice pawn majority here. 4 against only one developed pawn of blacks. Okay, we have a c5 and now d4, proposing to trade off in the middle and get that central pawn advantage. Knight comes out, begging to be pinned, but we have bishop to e3, adding another defender to this pawn. Queen now comes out, threatening this pawn on c3. Okay, what do we do? Bishop comes down to defend the pawn. Actually, that's adding two defenders at once because it's a discovered defense by the queen as well. However, this pawn is now attacked twice and defended only by the pawn. So, but here, if, for example, pawn takes, and the knight can't actually recapture because it would be a discovered attack on the queen. So the queen now retreats, knight to e2, adds a second defender to this pawn and develops. However, the light squared bishop, we have to say, is still trapped in. Bishop out to e7, g3, now prepares to give this bishop maybe some options in the future. Obviously can't be played right now. Castles, bishop g2. All right, so now we have a battery. We have queen and the bishop behind it looking at this pawn. Black develops the bishop, protecting the pawn, and now white castles. So interesting position. Both sides have lost one pawn and one knight. White has a decent mass of pawns in the middle of the board. Both sides are castled. How's it going to go? f6 by black. So we're now in the middle game. Both sides have castled, pretty much completed development, and now pawn breaks can be your friend. So e takes f6, bishop takes f6, queen dodges across to e3, attacking this undefended bishop and also getting out of ideas of this. Because there are possibilities, for example, bishop takes, this pawn with check and a discovery on the queen. So the only way out of that would be for the queen to block. Bishop takes queen, rook takes queen. So sensible move. Queen to e3. Pawn takes. Ah, you didn't spot, you didn't do your goldfish, did you? Yeah? You should do this. That's defending that, that's defending that. Queen's defending that. That's defended, that's not defended. That's not defended. Bishop's defending that. The knight is not defended and the bishop is not defended. Right? Only takes a few seconds to do that. Okay? Queen's moved there. My bishop isn't defended. What should I do? Protect the bishop. Okay? But we have pawn takes. Queen takes with check. King dodges away. Pawn recaptures. Knight takes. Knight takes. Bishop takes with check. King h1. Now white is up a bishop. White has the bishop pair. Black has one extra pawn. When did that happen? With check. This is a fork. It's not just a check. This is eviler than that. A fork on king and rook. Rook falls. Okay. And now we're in a very interesting position because we have a rook and two bishops against a pair of rooks. How's it going to go? We propose a trade of queens. We accept gratefully. Bishop grabs pawn. Okay, so now we have 4 pawns on each side and we have a rook and a bishop pair against 2 rooks. Which would you rather have? Rook comes down to attack the bishop, also skewering the bishop on the c2 pawn. Bishop retreats. Rook does not grab the pawn, but we have rook to e8. Bishop now comes back here, which is an interesting move. That is an interesting move. I mean, it's preventing that, but I think if to put the bishop on here, at least would have defended both pawns and still kept the bishop on that diagonal, preventing the king from moving. Rook takes pawn, obviously. Now the bishop comes back to b3, which it could have done on the previous move. Rook to f2. Rook to c1, king gets an escape square, h4 is now pushed, and now we have the attack of the rooks. Check, check, king moves, right? Now, if the king gets to here sometimes, if it's blocked by its own piece, it is possible to get a checkmate, but in this situation our bishops are guarding some key squares. Rook comes across, and now there is no mate. So the rook retreats to the back rank. Rook c2 proposes a trade. No way. Rook now grabs the pawn. King advances. Attacks the bishop. Okay, this is a nice motif to remember. You're attacking my bishop, but should the pawn move, there's an undefended rook behind it. So we pin the attacker. Check. Advance the king. Rook drops back. Bishop comes in with check. And this is where you get the power of the bishop pair, right? When you have bishops on adjacent diagonals, they create an impenetrable field, right? Like this, all the way across the board. So the king cannot get through this force field. So there's only one move here. King has to go to h7, check by the rook. And now actually this ends up in a forced checkmate, okay? If you want to pause the video and figure this out for yourself, it's a lovely little puzzle, okay? So even from like this position, check, okay? So remember, the king can't go on any of these squares. Either the rook has to block or the king has to move. King moves. Now what's the next move? Bishop f7 check. Okay, the king can't go here, 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 or here, or here. So again, only one move. King h7. Bishop retreats with check. King comes back here. Now rook to g6, g7, sorry, check. And the king can't go there, 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 there. Again, only one move. So maybe we didn't need to put in that first bishop check, but we'll see. Okay. And now bishop to e2. King can't go here because of the pawn. Can't go here because of the bishop. Can't stay where he is. Cannot go there. there's only one move to advance the pawn to block the check. Now bishop takes, protected by the rook, and that is another glorious checkmate. So there you go, 5 very nice games, all played at different levels. Lots of interesting tactics. Hope you've enjoyed that. I've certainly enjoyed going through the games myself. Thanks for watching. See you soon.